A bankrupt millionaire left a single mom to spend the night in his car. When he returned, he was shocked by what he saw. Rick Manning adjusted the collar of his security uniform as he watched raindrops assault the windows of New Horizons Mall. The storm that raged over New York City on that July night seemed to conspire with his somber mood. Just 2 years earlier, he had occupied the penthouse of one of the city's most luxurious high-rises, heading one of the country's largest real estate development companies. Now at 45, all he had left was a night shift as a security guard in the very same mall where he once operated one of his real estate empire's branches. It was 11:45 p.m. when he began his final round before midnight. The mall's lights were dimmed, casting elongated shadows along the empty corridors. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he checked every door, every display window, every dark corner. It was a monotonous job, but at least it paid the rent on the small apartment he now called home. Upon reaching the underground parking lot, his gaze was drawn to a vintage dark blue 1970s VW Beetle parked in one of the most remote spots. Through the fogged-up windows, he made out the silhouette of a young woman cradling an infant in her arms. His first instinct was to ignore the scene. He was no longer the man who cared about the fate of others. The years of decline had hardened his heart. The woman looked up and met his gaze. Even in the dim light, Rick could see a spark of dignity in her expression, a spark that painfully reminded him of who he once was before his fall from grace. She rolled down her window just a few inches, and her gentle voice cut through the silence of the parking garage. "Good evening, sir. I know I shouldn't be here, but the storm is so fierce and my baby has a fever. Could I possibly stay until the rain lets up?" Rick felt the weight of the mall's security manual in the pocket of his uniform. The rules were clear: no overnight stays in the parking lot. His job was exactly to prevent situations like this. But something about the way the woman held her baby, protecting him not only from the cold, but from the cruelty of the world, tugged at a long dormant cord in his chest. For a moment, he remembered the last time he had to make a difficult decision. It was when investors began pulling their capital from the development firm, and he, driven by pride and stubbornness, had refused to declare bankruptcy immediately. That decision cost him the final resources that might have ensured a less traumatic restart. "You can't stay here," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "The mall closes in 15 minutes. The woman's face showed no surprise or resentment, only a calm resignation that unsettled him even more. She nodded slightly, started her car, and began to maneuver out. That was when Rick noticed several bags filled with colorful fabrics and a portable sewing machine tucked away on the back seat of the Beetle. He watched through his rearview mirror as the little blue car disappeared into the stormy night, carrying its 2 occupants toward an uncertain destiny. The sound of rain against concrete seemed to amplify the weight of his decision. He resumed his rounds with heavy steps, trying to ignore the inner voice accusing him of having become exactly the kind of person he used to despise. The following hours dragged by torturously. With each peal of thunder, Rick imagined the Blue Beetle battling the storm, the young mother searching for a safe place to spend the night with her ailing child. He kept checking the security cameras overlooking the parking lot's entrance, as if expecting them to return. Around 3 a.m., when the storm finally began to relent, Rick found himself doing something he hadn't done in a long time: praying. Not a formal or elaborate prayer, just a silent plea that the woman and her baby might find a safe haven. And, perhaps more surprisingly, he caught himself wishing for a second chance, not to regain his lost fortune, but to do what was right this time. Morning arrived with that peculiar brightness that follows a great storm. As Rick finished his shift, his eyes heavy from a sleepless night, he decided to make one last check of the parking lot. His heart nearly stopped when he spotted the Blue Beetle again, now parked in a different spot near one of the service entrances. He approached cautiously, mentally preparing for the worst, but what he found left him dumbfounded. The interior of the car had been transformed into a makeshift art studio. The young woman, her baby now peacefully sleeping in a custom car seat, was intently working on her portable sewing machine. Her hands moved with impressive precision over the fabrics, creating shapes and patterns that seemed to dance under her fingers. "You're back," Rick managed, his voice betraying a mix of relief and astonishment. She looked up from her work, and for the first time Rick saw her face clearly. She was about 30, with delicate features and an air of serene determination. "I'm sorry," she said, without pausing her sewing. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I had to finish these pieces. They're for a client who—" Marina Carter." A refined, surprised voice interrupted the explanation. A well-dressed older woman strode toward the car, her heels clicking in the nearly empty parking lot. "I can't believe it's you." The seamstress paled slightly, her hands finally halting on the fabric. "Mrs. Beatrice Johnson, what a surprise." Rick watched the scene, confused, as the newcomer examined with a practiced eye the pieces that had accumulated on the Beetle's back seat. "I'd recognize your work anywhere," Mrs. Johnson declared reverently, picking up one of the items. "These appliques, these finishes, no one else can create such magic with fabric." Marina looked uncomfortable under the praise. "Please, Mrs. Johnson. No, don't be modest. You disappeared over a year ago after that ridiculous scandal with Lumina Fashion. Everyone in the fashion world knew they had stolen your designs, but you simply vanished before we could prove it." Rick felt his world spin. The young mother who had spent the night sewing in an old Beetle was Marina Carter, the breakthrough designer who had taken Paris by storm with her revolutionary creations. The very same who had mysteriously disappeared after a plagiarism scandal had dominated the fashion headlines. "Things have changed, Mrs. Johnson," Marina replied softly, adjusting the blanket covering her sleeping baby. "I have other priorities now." "Sure, I can see that." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly as she looked fondly at the baby. "But your talent, it can't be wasted like this. I'm organizing a charity event next month and I desperately need exclusive pieces. What do you say?" Rick noticed a flicker of hesitation in Marina's eyes. It was the same spark he saw in his own reflection every morning, the fear of taking risks, of trusting again after a deep disappointment. Before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "I have a space, an old store, my former boutique, right here in the mall. It's been closed for years, but it's yours if you want to use it as your studio." The two women stared at him as if they'd forgotten his presence. Marina frowned, confused. "Aren't you the security guard?" "I am. For now. But that's a story for another time." Rick pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and extended one toward Marina. "What do you say? It's better than working out of a parking lot." At that moment, the baby stirred, releasing a little yawn that seemed to melt the tension in the air. Marina looked at her son, then at the key, and finally at Mrs. Johnson, who waited expectantly for her answer. "Maybe," Marina began, a hesitant smile forming on her lips, "maybe it's time to stop running." Over the following week, the space that once housed the Manning Developments branch came to life under Marina's skilled hands. In no time, she had transformed the vacant store into a cozy studio, with scraps of colorful fabric decorating the key, walls and mannequins displaying her in-progress creations. Little Michael, her 8-month-old son, even had his own corner set up with soft cushions and educational toys. Rick watched the transformation during his rounds, always finding an excuse to linger near the studio. There was something magnetic about the way Marina worked, a blend of technical precision and pure artistic inspiration that captivated him. Sometimes watching her, he felt as though he recognized a familiar dance between needle and cloth, as if he had witnessed it once before in another life. "You really don't have to keep hovering," Marina remarked one particularly busy afternoon as she put the finishing touches on a piece for Mrs. Johnson's charity event. "I promise I won't turn your store into a gypsy camp." Rick smiled, still a bit awkward in his old security uniform. "I'm not hovering, I'm just making sure everything's all right." He paused to admire the details of a children's dress Marina had just completed. "Your creations are unlike anything I've ever seen. How do you manage these finishes?" Marina stopped her work and studied him with curiosity. "For someone who works security, you sure know a lot about garment details. Let's just say I had a touch of the fashion world in another life," he replied evasively, his gaze catching on a peculiar detail in one of the pieces. "This embroidery. It looks familiar." Marina's face tensed for a moment. It's an old technique I learned in college. My first mentor taught me. Her voice faltered slightly. It was a long time ago. Little Michael chose that moment to burst into a crystal-clear laugh, drawing both their attentions. He was playing with colorful fabric scraps, creating his own chaotic, innocent art. Rick scooped the baby into his arms with a natural ease that surprised them both. "He likes you," Marina observed, pleasantly surprised. "Usually he's shy around strangers." "Maybe he knows I'm not exactly a stranger," Rick murmured, more to himself than to her. He handed Michael back to her gently. "You know, Marina, I've been thinking, this space is too big for a one-person studio. Have you ever considered expanding?" Marina visibly tensed. "I don't want too much attention. Keeping a low profile has served me well." "I'm not talking about bright lights or runways," Rick clarified quickly. "But today I saw some moms in the mall peering at your work through the shop window. There's a market for high-quality children's clothing, especially with your unique talent." "And you know the market?" she asked, a hint of irony in her tone. Rick returned Michael to his little play nook, carefully rearranging the fabric scraps around the baby. "Let's say running a business is like riding a bike. You never really forget, even after a few falls." Marina was silent for a moment, her fingers absent-mindedly caressing a piece of silk. "Why are you doing this, Rick? Why help me when you hardly know me?" "Maybe because I need a second chance too," he answered sincerely. "Or perhaps because, watching you turn scraps into art, I begin to believe it's possible to rebuild something beautiful from broken pieces." The sound of the sewing machine filled the silence that followed, like a musical backdrop to their unspoken thoughts. Finally, Marina looked up from her fabric. "There's something I need to show you," she said, rising and walking over to a box tucked under her work table. "It's a project I've been secretly working on, something that could change everything." She withdrew from the box a piece of fabric that at first glance looked ordinary. However, when Rick touched it, he felt something different. Its texture was unique, as if the material breathed under his fingers. It was simultaneously resilient and incredibly soft, with a subtle sheen that shifted in the light. "It's a biodegradable fabric I developed," Marina explained in a low, contained tone of enthusiasm. "It's completely hypoallergenic and made entirely from recycled materials, perfect for children with sensitive skin." Rick handled the fabric with growing admiration. "That's extraordinary. How did you manage that?" "Years of research," she replied, watching Michael, who was now playing with a sample of the same material. "I started the project in college after I met a child with severe dermatitis who couldn't wear regular clothes. I always knew there was a solution. I just had to find it." As Marina spoke, a distant memory began to take shape in Rick's mind. A young college student presenting a revolutionary sustainable textile project at an entrepreneurship fair. He had been there as a judge, representing his then-thriving development company. The determination in the student's eyes had impressed him so much that... "The New Talent Award," he murmured, eyes widening in sudden realization. "New? York University 2015, that was you." Marina froze, the fabric slipping from her fingers. "How did you—" "I was one of the judges. I was the one who defended your project when the others wanted to pick something more commercial." Rick ran a hand through his hair, still stunned by the coincidence. "You won the award. The prize money should have funded your research." "And it did," Marina confirmed, studying his face with newfound understanding. "Rick Manning. Of course, you were different then. More rich, powerful, arrogant, confident. I'd say," she corrected softly. "Your vote of confidence changed my life. That award opened the doors to the fashion world in Paris. And now here we are," Rick finished, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You, a decorated designer working out of a borrowed studio, and me, your former patron, doing rounds as a security guard." Their silence was broken by Michael, who began clapping gleefully as if celebrating the adult's discovery. Marina scooped her son into her arms, her eyes fixed on Rick. "You know what's funny?" she said. "After everything fell apart, In Paris, after Lumina Fashion stole my designs, I thought often about that entrepreneurship fair, about how you defended my project, insisting that sometimes we must bet on something greater than immediate profits. Rick felt a lump in his throat. It's ironic, isn't it? I lost my way exactly because I forgot that lesson. Maybe it's not too late to relearn it, Marina suggested, picking up the special fabric again. This material isn't just a product, it's a statement about sustainability, about care, about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Just like that night in the storm, Rick murmured. Exactly like that night, she agreed. When you chose to follow the rules instead of your heart. And yet you came back anyway. Marina smiled as she settled Michael in her arms. Sometimes we have to give people a second chance to do what's right. And maybe I need someone with business experience to help turn this fabric into something that can truly help other children. Rick looked around the studio, at the delicate creations adorning the walls, the revolutionary fabric in his hands, and the baby watching him with curious eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. New Horizons Mall was beginning to change. What was once a silent, forgotten corridor on the second floor now attracted curious glances and excited chatter. Marina's little studio, officially still listed as the closed store in the mall's records, was slowly transforming into something greater than either of them had ever imagined. Now we need a name, Rick said one morning as he organized a spreadsheet of expenses on his tablet. He had traded his security uniform for a simple dress shirt, his last shift having been the night before. We can't keep calling it the closed store studio. Marina, nursing Michael, discreetly in her special chair in the corner of the studio, looked up thoughtfully. I was thinking something with butterflies, symbolizing transformation of fabrics of lives. Chrysalis, Rick interjected, his eyes lighting up with the same energy Marina was beginning to recognize, the energy he once had when a promising idea struck him. Chrysalis Kids, it's perfect for a sustainable children's clothing brand. The name stuck. In a matter of days, a tasteful but discreet sign was installed, and Rick finally got the store's status, officially regularized with mall management. The space gained its very own storefront, where child-sized mannequins proudly showcased pieces made from Marina's revolutionary fabric. The true turning point, however, came when Mrs. Beatrice Johnson arrived with her most important client. Clara Sanders, a famous actress known for her roles in television dramas and for her outspoken environmental activism. She was looking for a complete wardrobe for her son, Peter, who suffered from severe atopic dermatitis. It's incredible, Clara murmured, running her fingers over the fabric of a t-shirt. So soft. Peter has never been able to wear anything like this without having an allergic reaction. Marina exchanged a meaningful glance with Rick before replying, "It's because we developed this fabric specifically for children with sensitivities. It's completely hypoallergenic and biodegradable." Clara picked up several pieces, clearly moved. "You have no idea what this means. Peter missed so many birthday parties because he couldn't wear costumes." She paused, eyeing Michael playing happily with scraps of the same fabric. "Does your baby have sensitivities too?" "No," Marina smiled. "He's my quality consultant. If Michael approves the fabric, we know it's perfect." The actress laughed, charmed by the response. As they tried on the clothes, Rick noticed a subtle change in Marina's demeanor. She seemed more relaxed, more confident, as if every piece that Clara approved was a small personal victory. Later that afternoon, after Clara left with nearly the entire collection and placed a special order for Peter's birthday, Marina finally exhaled a sigh she'd been holding for hours. "Are you all right?" Rick asked, concerned. "She took photos," Marina replied, her voice tense. "Of the clothes, the studios, of us." Rick understood immediately. "You think soon someone will recognize you?" "It's only a matter of time. Clara Sanders has millions of followers. If she posts about the store..." "Maybe it's time," Rick suggested gently. "You're not alone in this anymore, Marina. And your story, it can inspire others." Marina cradled Michael, as she always did when she needed grounding. It's not just that. If Lumina Fashion finds out where I am and what I'm doing, let them come, Rick declared firmly, his voice surprising them both. This time you have something they can't copy. He stepped closer and lightly touched the special fabric displayed in the window. You have your own magic now, and you've got me. Marina's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. It was an Instagram notification. Clara Sanders had just posted a series of photos of the studio, along with an emotional caption about sustainability, inclusion, and the discovery of a brand that was revolutionizing children's fashion. The post quickly amassed thousands of likes and shares. The transformation of Chrysalis was only just beginning. That Instagram post had a cascade effect. In less than a week, Chrysalis Kids went from a secret little studio to the hottest topic in the sustainable fashion world. Specialized blogs tried to uncover more about the mysterious brand that had captured the attention of one of the country's most influential actresses. Social media buzzed with testimonials from mothers dreaming of dressing their children in truly hypoallergenic clothing. Rick watched the transformation with a mix of pride and apprehension. His business instincts told him they needed to seize the moment, to expand production, hire more people. Yet he also understood Marina's fear. Each new exposure was a risk of her past resurfacing. We need help, he declared one particularly hectic morning as Marina struggled to balance Michael in one arm while sewing with the other. We can't keep doing this all on our own. Marina hesitated, her hands pausing on the fabric. I'm not sure I'm ready to trust strangers. What if they aren't really strangers? Rick said as he pulled up a tablet and showed her a folder of resumes he'd compiled. They're all single mums like you. Some of them have been in tough spots and learned sewing through the mall's community programs. Marina's expression softened. You've been doing your research? Let's just say I've learned a few things on my night rounds, he grinned. There are so many talented people just waiting for an opportunity. Before Marina could respond further, the doorbell rang. An elegant woman entered, her gaze sweeping the space with a clinical interest. Marina visibly tensed beside Rick. Ms. Dupree, Marina murmured, instinctively clutching Michael tighter. Marina, my dear, the woman replied with a calculated smile, or should I say, the mysterious creator behind Chrysalis Kids. You've been causing quite a stir in Paris. Rick stepped in discreetly between Marina and the newcomer. May I help you? Ah, you must be the partner, Ms. Dupree said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I'm Adeline Dupree, creative director at Lumina Fashion. We're very interested in Marina's work. The air in the studio suddenly grew heavy. Rick could feel the tension emanating from Marina in palpable waves. Actually, Ms. Dupree continued, pulling an envelope from her designer portfolio, I'm here to make an offer. Lumina Fashion would like to buy Chrysalis Kids, and I should mention the offer is very generous. Marina finally found her voice. To steal my creations again? Oh, my dear, that was a terrible misunderstanding, Ms. Dupree replied, with false sweetness. This time we want to do everything by the book. In fact, she paused dramatically. We're even willing to credit you as the true creator of the special fabric. Rick watched the scene with growing understanding. Lumina Fashion wasn't merely interested in Marina's current designs. They coveted the revolutionary fabric and the technology that could transform the children's fashion industry. No, Marina declared firmly, her voice stronger than Rick had ever heard before. Chrysalis is not for sale. Think about it, dear, Ms. Dupree insisted. With our resources, we could take your technology worldwide, help thousands of children, and charge exorbitant prices for it? Rick interjected, his years of business experience surfacing in his firm tone. Turn something revolutionary into a luxury item that's out of reach. Ms. Dupree turned her calculating gaze to him. Business is business, sir. Marina has always been too idealistic to understand that, but you seem like a man who understands the value of a good opportunity. Rick smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Precisely because I understand business, my answer is no. Now, if you'll excuse us. After Ms. Dupree finally left, leaving the envelope with her proposal on a table, Marina slumped into her chair, trembling slightly. They're not "Going to give up," she whispered. Rick took the envelope and, without opening it, tore it to pieces. "Neither are we," he replied with conviction. "But you were right. We need help. People we can trust." Marina looked at the resumes still open on the tablet, then at Michael sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the storm on the horizon. "When do we start the interviews?" In no time at all, the Chrysalis Kids studio had become a hive of creative activity. After a week of careful interviews, Marina and Rick selected 5 women to form their initial team. Each of them brought not only technical skills, but also personal stories of overcoming adversity that resonated with the brand's very essence. There was Juliana, a young mother of twins who had learned to sew in a women's correctional facility and dreamed of a better future for her children. Sandra, who boasted over 20 years in garment production before losing everything when her ex-husband racked up debts in her name. Rose, a talented artisan who crafted unique pieces to support her daughter with special needs. Anna, a refugee from Venezuela with a background in fashion design. And Patricia, a young woman from a historically marginalized community who blended ancestral techniques with modern innovation. "It's amazing how each of them brings something unique to the project," Marina observed, as she watched Rose teach Juliana a special embroidery technique. Michael, now more sociable, played happily with Juliana's twins in a small children's area they'd set up at the back of the studio. Rick grinned as he organized the new orders that kept arriving. "You know what's even more amazing? The whole mall is changing because of Chrysalis." It was true. The corridor that once lay abandoned now buzzed with renewed energy. Other stores were reopening, drawn by the growing movement. An artisanal cafe had opened next door, serving organic drinks in biodegradable containers. Her children's bookstore had taken over another vacant space, creating a cozy environment, complete with story hours and recycling workshops. "Miss Marina," Anna called cheerfully from her workstation. "I think I've managed to adapt that finishing technique you taught for our plus-size pieces. Want to see?" Marina approached, carefully examining the work. Her team had evolved beyond mere seamstresses. They were artists and innovators, each contributing to the project's constant evolution. "Perfect, Anna," Marina praised sincerely. "This is going to help so many kids who can't find comfortable clothes in the regular market." Rick watched the interaction with growing pride. Marina had blossomed into a mentor, generously sharing her knowledge with patience and care. The initial fear of trusting others had given way to genuine collaboration and enrichment. Over lunch, one day at the new artisanal cafe, Rick brought up expansion. "We need to talk about growing. Orders have been skyrocketing ever since that sustainable fashion magazine featured us." Marina fiddled with Michael, who was trying to reach his natural sandwich. "I know, but I don't want to lose the essence of the project. Every piece must maintain our quality, our care. That's why I've been thinking differently," Rick continued, his eyes alight with familiar enthusiasm. "What if instead of merely ramping up production, we created a training program?" "How do you mean?" "We could convert part of the space into a school, teach other women in vulnerable situations, create new production hubs managed by them, always upholding our quality and sustainability standards." Marina considered the idea, glancing through the storefront at the 5 women who had become an integral part of Chrysalis. Each had already shown the potential to lead, to teach, to grow. "It would be a way to multiply not just production, but our social impact," she mused aloud. "Give other women the same chance we're getting." "Exactly," Rick smiled. "And there's more. I've been looking into grants for creative economies. With your revolutionary fabric and our social impact proposal, our chances for funding would be huge." Marina felt that familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. "But that would mean more exposure, more risk, or more protection," Rick argued gently. "The more people involved, the more lives we're transforming, the harder it becomes for Lumina Fashion or anyone else to swallow us up." At that moment, Patricia appeared in the cafe, carrying a prototype dress that blended traditional techniques with Marina's special fabric. The piece was breathtaking, a perfect fusion of heritage and innovation. "This is extraordinary," Marina murmured, running her fingers reverently over the fabric. That's what happens when you make room for different knowledges and stories, Rick commented softly. Imagine how many other Patricias, Annas and Roses are out there waiting for a chance. Little Michael clapped joyfully as if he understood the importance of the moment, drawing laughter from everyone. Marina looked at her son, the unique dress in her hands, and then at Rick. Okay, she decided firmly. Let's do it. Let's create Chrysalis School. News of Chrysalis School spread quickly on social media. The project had struck a chord with the public, not just about sustainable clothing, but about social transformation and giving voice and opportunity to people who were typically left on the fringes of the fashion industry. Clara Sanders, who had become an informal ambassador for the brand, shared an emotional video of her son Peter playing carefree at a children's party in a chrysalis outfit. For the first time, she wrote, "My son can just be a kid without worrying about allergies or discomfort." The video went viral, catching the attention of an independent documentary producer who wanted to make a film about chrysalis, not only focusing on the revolutionary fabric, but also on the transformation stories behind the brand. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Marina confessed to Rick as they ironed out details for the start of Chrysalis school classes. "Exposing my story means exposing Michael's as well." Rick, who was helping Juliana set up the schedule for the first classes, understood her concern. What if we focus on the students' stories, on the lives we're transforming? Before Marina could answer, Sandra rushed into the studio, her normally calm face etched with worry. "You need to see this," she said, extending her cell phone. It was an article on an international fashion website. Lumina Fashion had announced the launch of a sustainable children's clothing line using a revolutionary fabric developed in their research labs. "They can't do that," Anna exclaimed, reading over Sandra's shoulder. "It's plagiarism." Marina felt the ground slip from beneath her. It was Paris again, the same feeling of powerlessness, of watching her work being stolen without being able to do anything. But this time, things were different. Rick was already on the phone, his years of business experience evident in his firm tone. "Dr. Helen? Yes, we need to activate the patent registration right away." "Patent?" Marina asked, confused. "Remember those documents we signed last week? They weren't just for Chrysalis School," he explained, covering the phone with his hand. "I registered the technology for your fabric as soon as we started our partnership. I was just waiting for the right moment to mention it." The women in the studio gathered around, forming a protective circle around Marina and Michael. Rose was the first to speak. "We're not going to let them steal it from you again." "Chrysalis is more than a brand now," Patricia added. "It's our family." Marina looked around at the determined faces, women who, like her, had found not just a job, but a purpose. The fear was giving way to something stronger, determination. "You know what's ironic?" she said, picking up a piece of the special fabric. "They might try to copy the formula, but they'll never be able to replicate what truly makes Chrysalis special." "What is it?" Juliana asked as her twins played with Michael in the children's corner. "This," Marina said, gesturing to the group, "the story behind every piece, the love in every stitch, the transformation in every life touched by our project." Rick, having just ended the phone call, smiled. "Dr. Helen is on her way. And as for that documentary producer, I think it's time we told our story, all of our stories." Anna, checking social media on her phone, exclaimed, "You won't believe it! People are sharing their experiences with Chrysalis using the hashtag #WeAreAllChrysalis. It's trending." Marina cradled Michael, feeling her heart beat in sync with his. She looked around at the bustling studio, the samples of the special fabric, the determined faces of her team. Lumina Fashion might try to copy her fabric, but they would never replicate the true essence of Chrysalis. "So," she finally said, "let's tell our story, all of it." Before long, the Chrysalis studio had transformed into a small film set. Lights, cameras, and microphones coexisted with sewing machines and mannequins as Julia Chambers, the documentary director with an eye for the beauty in the small details, captured the daily life of the studio. She focused on the satisfied smile of a seamstress finishing a piece, on children laughing in the play area, on the students at Chrysalis School mastering new techniques. "There's something magical happening here," Julia commented while reviewing a few shots with Marina. "It's as if every garment carries a piece of the maker's soul." On screen, Sandra was shown teaching a new student how to work with the special fabric. The camera captured the exact moment the student's eyes widened upon touching the material. "It's like silk and a cloud at once," the student had said, mesmerized. Rick, now dividing his time between managing Chrysalis and teaching entrepreneurship classes at the school, walked over with Michael in his arms. The baby had become the official mascot of the documentary, always eliciting smiles with his antics. "The enrollment for the next class has already passed 1,000, he announced, glancing at his tablet with one hand free. "And 3 students from the first class are already setting up their own mini-studios in their communities." Marina smiled as she watched more scenes of the documentary play on a monitor. There was Rose, recounting how her daughter's sensitive skin had inspired her dedication to the project. Patricia, explaining how traditional techniques from her heritage could be blended with contemporary design. And Anna, translating the dreams of other refugees into real opportunities for a fresh start. "Do you know what's even more impressive?" Julia interjected as she shifted to another sequence of images. "The way the entire mall has transformed. Look at this." The footage showed the once empty corridor now pulsing with life. The children's bookstore held storytelling sessions featuring Chrysalis outfits. The cafe had expanded, hosting cultural events, and new stores were springing up, all aligned with values of sustainability and social impact. New horizons. Mall has become a benchmark for creative economies, Rick said proudly. "Other malls are now coming to us wanting to replicate the model." A movement at the entrance of the studio caught everyone's attention. It was Clara Sanders, arriving for her segment in the documentary. Alongside her, little Peter ran excitedly to join Michael and the other children. "I still get emotional every time I come here," Clara said as she embraced Marina. "You're not just making clothes, you're changing lives." Julia signaled for the film crew to step back, giving space for a more intimate conversation. Marina took the opportunity to show Clara the latest autumn-winter collection, developed collaboratively by the team. "Marina," Clara said softly, as she examined a finely finished jacket, "have you ever thought about using the documentary to tell your full story? About Paris, about Lumina fashion?" Marina hesitated, her gaze drifting to Michael playing carefree. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "Sometimes," Rick gently interjected, "our personal stories can be the key to helping others find the courage to start over." Julia, who had rejoined them, nodded. "We don't have to focus on the conflict or the drama. We can tell a story of overcoming adversity, of how sometimes we have to lose everything to find something much greater." Marina surveyed the bustling studio, the students learning, her partners, creating and innovating. She saw the smiling faces of children playing, free from worries about allergies or discomfort. She thought of all the mothers who, like her, had found not just a job at Chrysalis, but a renewed purpose. "Maybe," she finally said, "it's time to show that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of something far more beautiful." Clara smiled, taking Marina's hands. "And we'll be here to support you. All of us." Bam. That moment, as if the universe were affirming her words, Michael toddled over carrying a scrap of the special fabric that had transformed so many lives. Marina scooped him up, feeling her heart swell. "Okay," she said to Julia, who quickly signaled the cameraman. "Let's tell this story, starting with that stormy night when a bitter ex-businessman chose to follow the rules instead of his heart." Rick, approaching with a cup of coffee, paused mid-step, a surprised smile on his face. It was the first time Marina had spoken openly about that night. The auditorium at New Horizons Mall was packed for the preview of the documentary Chrysalis, The Art of Starting Over. The venue, recently renovated thanks to the mall's turnaround, could barely accommodate all the guests. In the front row, Marina cradled Michael, surrounded by her team, Chrysalis school students and family. Rick, dapper in his first new suit in years, sat beside her. "Nervous?" he whispered, noticing how she gripped his hand. "A little," Marina admitted. "It's strange to see our story through someone else's eyes." The lights dimmed. And the documentary began. Julia's film had masterfully intertwined the various narratives. The story opened with images of the empty parking lot on that stormy night, narrated by Rick in a surprising moment of vulnerability. On that night, his voice narrated over the dark images, "I was a broken man following the rules because I'd lost the ability to trust my own heart." The narrative smoothly transitioned to dawn, showing the moment he found Marina working in her little Beetle. The film alternated between delicate reenactments and moving interviews with everyone involved. Marina's journey in Paris was treated with sensitivity, focusing not on the scandal with Lumina fashion, but on her rediscovery. Archival footage showed her early successes, including the moment she won that award, with a young, confident Rick among the judging panel. The entire audience held its breath when the documentary revealed that past connection. Marina noticed Rick stiffen beside her. It was the first time he too was confronted with those old images. Yet the heart of the film lay in the transformation stories. Julia had captured precious moments. Juliana teaching her twins how to identify different fabrics. Sandra regaining her self-esteem by leading important projects. Rose developing a special line for children with unique needs. The camera followed Anna on a visit to a refugee center, where she now taught sewing and entrepreneurship. It showed Patricia in her community, proudly explaining how ancestral techniques were being preserved and celebrated through sustainable fashion. The documentary didn't shy away from challenges. It addressed Lumina Fashion's attempt to copy the special fabric, focusing instead on the community's response, the viral hashtag #We'reAllChrysalis, and the thousands of supportive messages flooding social media. The true innovation of Chrysalis, Clara said at one particularly moving moment, is not just in the revolutionary fabric, it's in how you transformed a product into a movement for social change. When the lights came up, not a dry eye was in the auditorium. Michael, who had surprisingly watched the entire film quietly, was the first to applaud, sparking a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Julia took the stage to thank everyone, inviting Marina and Rick to join her. As they walked down the corridor, Marina noticed something extraordinary. Every person present wore at least one piece from Chrysalis, not only the children but adults too, sporting pins, scarves, and accessories crafted from the special fabric. "This reminds me of that entrepreneurship fair," Rick murmured as they ascended the stage. "When I first saw your eyes light up talking about social change through fashion." Marina smiled, cradling Michael in her arms. "Who would have thought we'd have to lose everything to find something so much greater?" On stage, Julia prepared to make a special announcement. The documentary had been selected for major international festivals, and beyond that, universities across the country wanted to use Chrysalis as a case study in social entrepreneurship. But the most important thing, Julia concluded, is that other communities are already mobilizing to replicate the Chrysalis model. What began in a parking lot on a stormy night is becoming a nationwide movement for empowerment and sustainability. Marina looked out at the audience, her new world, her expanded family. She saw hope in the eyes of the school's students, pride on her team's faces, and love in Michael's smile. And when her eyes met Rick's, she saw something more. The certainty that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as storms. The success of the documentary Chrysalis, The Art of Starting Over at international festivals ushered in a wave of change no one could have predicted. Marina watched in wonder as the auditorium at New Horizons Mall filled once more, this time for the first official graduation of Chrysalis School. 50 women, each with a unique story of overcoming adversity, prepared to receive their certificates. But it wasn't just a diploma they would take with them. Each had a fully structured business plan, guaranteed mentorship, and in many cases, small startup funds to launch their own ventures. "Who would have thought," Rick commented, adjusting the bow tie on a nearly 2-year-old Michael who now sported his own tiny bow tie, "that your little blue beetle would transform into all of this?" That all of this went far beyond a graduation ceremony. Chrysalis had become a social business model studied in universities around the world. The mall, once on the brink of closure, had become a hub of creative and sustainable economy with a waiting list of retailers eager to join the movement. Marina's revolutionary fabric had transformed not only children's fashion, but the entire textile industry. After winning the lawsuit against Lumina Fashion, she made a surprising decision. She made the technology available under an open patent model, on the condition it was used only for projects with proven social impact. Marina. A familiar voice called. It was Anna, now the coordinator of the training program for refugees. I need you to meet someone. Beside her stood a young Syrian woman, her eyes bright with the same determination Marina recognized from her own journey. This is Amira, Anna introduced. She's developed an embroidery technique that perfectly complements our special fabric. Marina watched the young woman's work with admiration for the delicacy and innovation in her stitching. This was what moved her the most, seeing each new person who joined the project bring something unique, expanding the horizons of what was possible. On stage, Juliana, now director of Chrysalis School, prepared to begin the ceremony. Her twins, inseparable from Michael, played under the watchful eye of Sandra, who had become a grandmotherly figure to all the project's children. Before we begin, Juliana announced into the microphone, I have a special piece of news to share. New York University has officially approved our partnership. Starting next semester, Chrysalis School will also serve as a research center in sustainable textile technology. The auditorium erupted in applause. Marina's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the faces of her students, no, her successors, radiant with pride and possibility. Rick gently took her hand, and she noticed he too was moved. You know what's even more amazing? He whispered. Every one of these women is going to go out and plant their own seeds. In a few years, there'll be hundreds of little chrysalis ventures all over the country. Marina looked at Michael, who was now trying to climb onto Patricia's lap. Her son had grown up amidst this diverse, supportive community, learning from an early age the value of solidarity and purposeful work. Rose approached with her daughter, Amanda, who was wearing a dress specially designed for her sensory needs. Marina, Rose said softly, remember when you taught me that every piece of clothing should be more than just a product? How could she forget? It was one of Chrysalis's core principles. Each creation was to carry not only functionality, but also the love, care, and history of both its maker and its wearer. Look, Rose continued, showing a small brooch that every graduate now wore. Each of these brooches has a unique story woven into it. 50 different stories of overcoming, all connected by the thread of hope that you and Rick planted on that stormy night. Marina picked up one of the brooches, feeling the tiny stitches that told stories of new beginnings. She remembered her own journey, from the glamour of Paris to the loneliness of a parking lot, and finally to the realization that sometimes we have to lose everything to find our true purpose. The ceremony began, ushering in a new chapter for Chrysalis. Every name called on stage represented not just a story of transformation, but a promise of continuity. The seed planted on that stormy night had blossomed into an entire forest of possibilities. On the morning of Chrysalis's second anniversary, Marina arrived early at the studio. New Horizons Mall was still quiet, but she could sense the energy of the transformations that had taken place there. She strolled through the corridors, recalling when the space was nothing more than a series of vacant stores and abandoned dreams. She stopped in front of the Chrysalis storefront, which now looked far different from its first improvised incarnation. In the center, a mannequin displayed the very first dress she had sewn on that stormy night. A simple piece that had sparked a revolution. I knew I'd find you here, Rick's voice sounded from behind her. He hadn't worn his security uniform in ages, but he'd kept his habit of arriving early, always with a cup of coffee from the neighboring cafe. I was reminiscing, Marina smiled, accepting the coffee he offered. Sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday we were in that parking lot. The sound of cheerful voices interrupted the nostalgic moment. It was the first group of students arriving for the day, 3 women who had come from different parts of the country for a special training program. Chrysalis School was now welcoming people from all over, each leaving not just with sewing techniques but with a philosophy of social transformation. Little Michael, arriving in Sandra's arms, she insisted on picking him up every morning, ran into his mother's embrace as soon as he saw her. "Mommy, look!" he exclaimed proudly, showing a small scrap of fabric where he'd made his first wobbly stitches. "Just like Mommy," Rick commented, ruffling the little boy's hair affectionately. He was born with a gift. Gradually, the studio came to life. Anna led a video conference with a group of refugees in Europe interested in replicating the chrysalis model. Patricia guided 2 students from her community on incorporating traditional techniques into modern design. Rose put the finishing touches on a special collection designed for children with varied needs. "Marina," Juliana called, approaching with an envelope in her hand. "This just arrived from the university." It was the official confirmation. The technology behind the revolutionary fabric had been internationally recognized as a breakthrough in sustainable textiles. More importantly, the open patent model was inspiring other companies to adopt more ethical and inclusive practices. "You know what that means?" Rick asked, reading the document over Marina's shoulder. "You did it. You transformed your greatest defeat into a victory, not just for you, but for all of us." Marina looked around at the busy studio, the hum of sewing machines, the laughter of children in the play area, the lively discussions among students and mentors. Every person there carried a story of overcoming. Every garment told a narrative of transformation. "No," she corrected gently. "We did it. We all did." At that moment, Clara Sanders entered the studio, accompanied by a film crew. The Aitia documentary had inspired a series on social businesses, and chrysalis would be featured in the first episode. "Before we begin," Clara announced, "I have a surprise." With a signal, Peter ran in wearing the uniform of his new school, crafted naturally from chrysalis's special fabric. The whole school adopted the uniforms, every child, whether they have sensitive skin or not, united by the same fabric. Michael ran off to embrace a friend, and soon other children joined the celebration. Marina watched the scene with a heart full of joy. Here was the true essence of chrysalis, not just in the clothes or the revolutionary fabric, but in the ability to weave connections, transform lives, and create a community where every person could be exactly who they were meant to be. Rick draped an arm around her, and she allowed herself to relax into that embrace that had become her safe haven. "I'm so glad you came back that night," he murmured. "I'm even more glad you learned to follow your heart instead of just the rules," she replied. The sound of sewing machines, the lively voices of students, the joyful laughter of children, everything blended into a symphony of new beginnings and endless possibilities. Chrysalis had become far more than a brand or a school. It was a living, breathing movement that would continue to grow and evolve through every story that passed through its doors. Marina picked up a scrap of the special fabric, feeling its unique texture under her fingertips. In it, she sensed the dreams, hopes, and stories of every life chrysalis had touched. It was the fabric of new beginnings, second chances, and transformation. It was the fabric of dreams realized.